You're watching the Everything Network. In the late 19th century, Monk Eastman ran a powerful Jewish gang that competed with Italian and Irish gangs, notably Paul Kelly's 5 Points gang, for control of New York's underworld. Another notorious faction, known as the Lenox Avenue Gang, led by Harry "Gyp the Blood" Horowitz, consisted of mostly Jewish members and some Italian members, such as Francesco Serafisi. It was one of the most violent gangs of the early 20th century and became famous for the murder of gambler and gangster Herman Rosenthal. In the early 1920s, stimulated by the economic opportunities of the Roaring Twenties, and later stimulated by Prohibition, Jewish organized crime figures such as Arnold Rothstein were controlling a wide range of criminal enterprises, including bootlegging, loan sharking, gambling, and bookmaking. According to crime writer Leo Katcher, Rothstein transformed organized crime from a thuggish activity by hoodlums into a big business, run like a corporation, with himself at the top. At the same time, the Jewish bootlegging mob known as the Purple Gang dominated the Detroit underworld during Prohibition, while the Jewish Bugs and Maya crew operated in the Lower East Side of New York City before being absorbed into Murder, Incorporated, and becoming affiliates of the Italian-American Mafia. The largely Jewish-American and Italian-American gang, which was known as Murder, Inc., and Jewish mobsters such as Meyer Lansky, Mickey Cohen, Harold "Hookie" Rothman, Dutch Schultz, and Bugsy Siegel, developed close ties with the Italian-American Mafia and gained a significant amount of influence within it. Eventually, they formed a loosely organized, mostly Jewish and Italian criminal syndicate, which the press named the National Crime Syndicate. Jewish and Italian crime groups increasingly became interconnected in the 1920s and 1930s, and their connections continued into the 1960s and beyond, partially because both groups often occupied the same neighborhoods and social statuses of the time. The two ethnic crime groups became especially close in New York City following the establishment of the close relationship between partners Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, and their subsequent elimination of many of the so-called Mustache Pete types, Sicilian-born gangsters who often refused to work with non-Italians and even non-Sicilians. The lines between Jewish and Italian criminal organizations often blurred throughout the 20th century. For decades after, Jewish American mobsters would continue to work closely and at times compete with Italian-American organized crime. Jewish American gangsters were involved in many different criminal activities, including murder, racketeering, bootlegging, prostitution, and narcotics. Their role was also significant in New York's burgeoning labor movement, especially the garment and trucking unions, as well as the poultry industry. Jewish organized crime fueled anti-Semitism and deeply concerned the Jewish community. Jewish organized crime was used by anti-Semites and anti-immigration supporters as arguments to bolster their agenda. Jewish gangs controlled portions of the Lower East Side and Brownsville in New York City, and were also present in other major American cities. American Jewish Mafia boss Kid Can held sway over Minneapolis for over 4 decades and remains the most notorious mobster in the history of Minnesota. Jewish American organized crime was a reflection of the ethnic succession among gangsters, which has tended to follow the immigrant waves in the United States: English, German, Irish, Jewish, Italian, Asian, and Latino. Ethnic involvement in organized crime gave rise to alien conspiracy theories in the U.S. law enforcement community, in which the conception of organized crime as an alien and united entity was vital. The involvement of a small percentage of recent immigrants in organized crime created a lasting stereotype of devious immigrants, corrupting the morality of native-born Americans. Organized crime was a complex set of relations between the recently arrived Jewish and Italian criminals and groups like the Irish American Organized Crime Networks, which had been established before the 1920s, and which the newer groups were sometimes subordinate to. Although never receiving close to the level of cultural attention of the Italian-American Mafia, from the late 1960s, Jewish American gangsters would figure as characters in Jewish American literature. For some writers, Jewish gangsters and boxers in the post-World War II era were seen as tougher, more aggressive literary role models, freeing the community from the stigma of defenselessness and powerlessness, compared with the physical aggressiveness and lawlessness more associated with the Irish and Italian immigrants. According to Rich Cohen, author of Tough Jews, Fathers, Sons, and Gangster Dreams, if Jewish gangsters still thrived today, if they hadn't gone legit, if Jews of my generation didn't regard them as figments, creatures to be classed with Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, I think the Jewish community would be better off. However, Cohen's description of Jewish gangsters ignores their criminality and immorality. These were still gangsters who extorted and murdered other members of the Jewish American community for profit. They allegedly forced Jewish women into prostitution and were generally considered a scourge within their own community. The Yiddish press and literature of the 1920s and 1930s were resolute in their condemnation of Jewish mobsters. A large wave of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries produced Jewish mobsters such as Max Kid Twist Zwerbach, Big Jack Zelig, and Vach Cyclone Louis Lewis, who competed with and were acknowledged by Italian and Irish gangs. Just as with their Italian counterparts, gangs specializing in extortion began operating in the heavily Jewish neighborhoods of New York's Lower East Side. Most prominently the so-called Yiddish Black Hand, headed by Jacob Levinsky, Charlie the Cripple Litovsky, and Joseph Toplinsky during the early 20th century. A significant Jewish underworld already existed in New York at the start of the 20th century, with Jewish mobsters conversing in a jargon with Yiddish origins. A pimp was known as a simcha, a detective as a shamus, and a loafer as a trombonik. Jewish American organized crime arose among slum kids who as prepubescents stole from pushcarts, who as adolescents extorted money from store owners, who as young adults practiced slamming, wielding an iron pipe wrapped in newspaper against striking workers or against scabs, until as adults they joined well-organized gangs involved in a wide variety of criminal enterprises boosted by Prohibition. The lure of quick money, power, and the romance of the criminal lifestyle was attractive to both second-generation Jewish and Italian immigrants. There was a supposed Jewish crime wave in early 20th century New York. In disturbing numbers, young Jews had joined crime rackets, it was said, along with children of Irish, Italian, and other immigrants. However, the supposed Jewish immigrant crime wave may have been exaggerated by the press and law enforcement. Crime and population figures show that Jews in New York committed crimes at a rate far below the average for the wider society. As described by sociologist Steven Steinberg, less than a sixth of the city's felony arrests were Jews during the 1920s, when Jews constituted nearly a third of the city's population. As the 20th century progressed, Jewish American mobsters such as Dopey Benny Fine and Joe the Greaser Rosenzweig entered labor racketeering, hiring out to both businesses and labor unions as strong-arm men. Labor racketeering, or labor slugging as it was known, would become a source of conflict as it came under the domination of several racketeers, including former 5 Points gang members Nathan Kid Dropper Kaplan and Johnny Spanish during the labor slugger wars, until its eventual takeover by Jacob Gurra Shapiro in 1927. Other Jewish organized crime figures involved in controlling labor unions include Moses Annenberg and Arnold Rothstein, the latter reportedly responsible for fixing the 1919 World Series. According to crime writer Leo Katcher, Rothstein transformed organized crime from a thuggish activity by hoodlums into a big business, run like a corporation, with himself at the top. According to Rich Cohen, Rothstein was the person to see during Prohibition, 1920-1933, if one had an idea for a tremendous business opportunity, legal or not. Rothstein understood the truths of early 20th century capitalism, hypocrisy, exclusion, greed, and came to dominate them. According to Cohen, Rothstein was the Moses of Jewish gangsters, a rich man's son, who showed the young and uneducated hoodlums of the Bowery how to have style. Lucky Luciano, who would become a prominent boss within the Italian-American Mafia and organize New York's Five Families, once claimed that Arnold Rothstein taught me how to dress. The stereotypical attire of the American mobster portrayed in movies can partially trace its roots directly to Rothstein. During Prohibition, Jewish gangsters became major operatives in the American underworld and played prominent roles in the distribution of illegal alcohol and the spread of organized crime throughout the United States. At the time, Jewish gangs operated primarily in America's largest cities, including Cleveland, Detroit, Minneapolis, Newark, New York City, and Philadelphia. Numerous bootlegging gangs such as the Bug and Meyer Mob, headed by Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, and Abe Bernstein's Purple Gang, would see the rise of Jewish American organized crime to its height. Other Jewish mobsters, including Dutch Schultz of New York City, Mo Dalitz of Michigan, Kid Can of Minneapolis, Charles King Solomon of Boston, and Abner Longy Zwillman, the Al Capone of New Jersey, became wealthy during Prohibition. During this time, Luciano successfully eliminated the old-world Sicilian mafia bosses like Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano in the 1931 Castellammarese War and took control of the New York Italian mafia. Luciano did not discriminate against Jews and valued longtime associates such as Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Several Jewish gangsters such as Red Levine and Bo Weinberg were used in the war as unsuspected non-Italian hitmen. After Masseria and Maranzano were murdered, a conference was held at New York's Franconia Hotel on November 11, 1931, which included Jewish mobsters such as Jacob Shapiro, Louis Lepke Buchalter, Joseph Doc Stacker, Hyman Curly Holtz, Louis Shadows Kravitz, Harry Teitelbaum, Philip Little Farvel Kovalik, and Harry Big Greenie Greenberg. During this meeting, Luciano and Lansky convinced the Jewish American mobsters of the benefits of cooperating with the Italian-American Mafia in a newly created consortium called the National Crime Syndicate by the press. Those Jewish gangsters hostile to the idea of cooperation with non-Jewish rivals gradually receded, most notably Philadelphia bootlegger Waxy Gordon, who was convicted and imprisoned for tax evasion based on evidence provided to United States Attorney Thomas E. Dewey by Lansky. Following Gordon's imprisonment, his operations were assumed by Nig Rosen and Max Boohoo Hoff. Waxy Gordon's rise slowed down when Rothstein died. Gordon had a large million-dollar operation that included many trucks, buildings, processing plants, and associated employees, and his business front could not account for this ownership and cash flow, and he paid no taxes on it. Gordon was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. At this time, he was married to a rabbi's daughter, and their son was in medical school. This son died in a weather-related automobile accident while traveling from an out-of-town college, planning to plead with the judge for leniency with his father's sentence. Gordon had tried to insulate his otherwise respectable family from his organized crime career, and the incident greatly shocked their relations, and great stress was put on the deteriorating marriage. During Prohibition, Mo Dalitz established the Cleveland Syndicate with fellow Jewish gangsters Louis Rothkopf, Maurice Klein, Sam Tucker, Charles Polizzi, and Irish gangster Blackjack McGinty. Charles Polizzi was born Leo Berkowitz to Jewish biological parents who died when he was an infant. Charles was adopted by the Polizzi family, and his adoptive brother, Alfred Polizzi, was the head of the Italian Mayfield Road mob. The syndicate was heavily involved with bootlegging on Lake Erie and developed what was known as the Little Jewish Navy. The syndicate operated casinos in Youngstown, northern Kentucky, and Florida. The syndicate attended the Atlantic City Conference representing Cleveland. The syndicate ran numerous casinos in Newport, Kentucky, including the original The Flamingo Hotel and Casino opens, 1946, and Tropicana. The syndicate's reign in northern Kentucky came to an end following a botched attempt to discredit George Ratterman, a candidate for sheriff, and a federal crackdown during the Kennedy administration. The Cleveland mob were early investors in the Desert Inn in Las Vegas and owned it until it was purchased by Howard Hughes. Its members invested in horse tracks including River Downs, Fairgrounds Racecourse, Thistledown Racecourse, Fairmount Park Racetrack, Aurora Downs, and the Agua Caliente Racetrack. Under Lansky, Jewish mobsters became involved in syndicate gambling interests in Cuba, Miami, and Las Vegas. Buckhalter would also lead the predominantly Jewish Murder Inc. as the Luciano crime family exclusive hitman. Following World War II, the dominant figures in organized crime tended to be second-generation Italian Americans and Jewish Americans. As late as the 1960s, Jewish presence in organized crime was still acknowledged as being of significance. As Los Angeles mobster Jack Dragner explained to hitman and later government informant Jimmy Fratiano, "Meyer's got a Jewish family built along the same lines as our thing. But his family's all over the country. He's got guys like Lou Rhodey and Dalitz, Doc Stacher, Gus Greenbaum, sharp fucking guys, good businessmen, and they know better than try to fuck us." Jewish mobsters, such as Meyer Lansky and the Los Angeles-based Mickey Cohen, along with Harold Hookie Rothman, continued to hold significant power and control organized crime groups in New York City, New Jersey, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, and Las Vegas, while the Jewish American presence remained strong in Italian American criminal rackets. Shondor Burns was a Jewish crime boss in Cleveland who controlled numbers, prostitution, theft, and gambling rackets. Burns was active until 1975, when he was murdered by Irish gangster Danny Green. Jewish American organized crime derived from dislocation and poverty, where language and custom made the community vulnerable to undesirables, the sort of thing that it is claimed fosters criminality among any other ethnicity in a similar situation. As American Jews improved their conditions, the Jewish thug and racketeer either disappeared or merged into a more assimilated American crime environment. American Jews quietly buried the public memory of the gangster past. Unlike the Mafia, famous Jewish American gangsters like Meyer Lansky, Dutch Schultz, and Bugsy Siegel founded no crime families. Much like Irish Americans and other ethnicities, with the exception of Italian American criminal organizations, Jewish American presence in organized crime began to decline after World War II. Jewish American individuals remain closely associated with organized crime, especially Italian American and Israeli organized crime, but the Jewish American criminal organizations and gangs, which once rivaled the Italian and Irish American mobsters during the first half of the 20th century, have largely faded. In more recent years, Jewish American organized crime has reappeared in the form of Orthodox Jewish, Israeli, and Jewish Russian Mafia criminal groups. Many of the Russian mobsters active in New York, especially Brighton Beach, are actually Soviet Jews, including Marat Balagula, Boris Neifeld, and Evsei Agron. From the 1990s until 2013, members of the New York divorce coercion gang kidnapped and tortured Orthodox Jewish men in troubled marriages to force them into granting religious divorces to their wives, in some cases extorting money from them. Described by prosecutors as a criminal syndicate that was akin to the Bloods, the Crips, or the Mafia, the organization, which charged up to $100,000 for their services, was shut down in the wake of a sting operation orchestrated by the FBI. While some tried to draw a distinction between the actions of the well-organized operation described by prosecutors and traditional kidnapping cases coming before judges that involved murder, terrorism, or child abduction, Judge Freda Wolfson said she didn't see any difference. Gang leader Mendel Epstein was sentenced in 2015 to 10 years in prison for the kidnappings, and co-conspirator Martin Wollmark was sentenced to more than 3 years in prison and a $50,000 fine. In another development, a 2016 sting collared Aharon Goldberg and Shimon Leibowitz, two Satmar Hasidic Jews who were part of what the Forward described as the Orthodox divorce underworld. The pair had colluded with a third man to perform a contract killing on an estranged husband. Several notable Jewish American mobsters provided financial support for Israel through donations to Jewish organizations since the country's creation in 1948. Jewish American gangsters used Israel's law of return to flee criminal charges or face deportation. Notables include Joseph "Doc" Stacker, who built up Las Vegas by pairing the Jewish and Italian Mafia into a national organized crime syndicate. Prime Minister Golda Meir set out to reverse this trend in 1970, when she denied entrance to Meyer Lansky. In 2010, it was reported by WikiLeaks that the United States Embassy in Israel, in a cable titled "Israel, the Promised Land of Organized Crime," had expressed grave concern about the activities of Israeli organized crime figures and was taking measures to prevent members of crime families from being issued visas to the United States. American diplomats expressed concern that Inbal Gavrieli, the niece of one of Israel's most powerful mafia bosses, had been elected to the Knesset as an MK for Likud. The code of silence among Soviet Jewish immigrants into New York City's Brighton Beach and other neighborhoods like it nationwide under the Jackson-Vanik Amendment have shielded new Jewish American gangsters, such as Marat Balagula, Boris Neifeld, Monya Elson, and Ludwig Feinberg. They were raised, however, as secular Jews, and share more in common culturally with Gentiles from the former Soviet Union than with their predecessors, such as Meyer Lansky, Kid Khan, and Mickey Cohen, who grew up in families that practiced Orthodox Judaism. Soviet Jewish organized crime figures from other nations, such as Budapest-based Semyon Mogilevich, have also attempted to penetrate the United States, including participating in a $10 billion money laundering operation through the Bank of New York in 1998. Organized criminals from the State of Israel have also had a presence in the United States. The Israeli Mafia, especially the Tel Aviv-based Abigail crime family, has also been heavily involved in ecstasy trafficking to America. You're watching the Everything Network. The Eastman Gang was the last of New York's street gangs, which dominated the city's underworld during the late 1890s until the early 1910s. Along with the 5 Points Gang under Italian-American Paolo Antonio Vaccarelli, best known as Paul Kelly, the Eastman Gang succeeded the long-dominant YOs as the first non-Irish street gang to gain prominence in the underworld during the 1890s. Its rise marked the beginning of a 40 to 50-year period of strong Jewish American influence within organized crime in New York City. Under the leadership of Monk Eastman, a well-known bouncer and hired thug, the Eastman gang spent the next decade establishing a criminal empire in Manhattan's Lower East Side through criminal activities, including prostitution and illegal gambling. They operated stuss games and established strong political connections through Tammany Hall. According to an article in the April 26, 1903 edition of the New York Daily Tribune, the gang that would become Eastman's first coalesced in the early 1890s. They started out in the notorious Corlear's Hook section of the Lower East Side on Rivington Street in the vicinity of Mangin and Girk Streets. Another gang of the era, the Short Tails, had its headquarters in this same area, and the Eastman gang may have developed from that group. Originally composed of largely Irish and Italian Catholics from the local slums, the gang quickly became almost exclusively Jewish, as a wave of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe settled into Lower Manhattan and nearby Brooklyn. When Monk Eastman entered the gang is unknown. His father abandoned his family when Eastman was 5 years old, and he lived with his mother and sisters in her father's household. Several newspaper articles refer to Eastman as from Corlear's Hook, so he was likely involved from this early era. His background was Yankee. Eastman immigrants came from England in the colonial period, but he originally had many ethnic Irish associates. By the start of the 20th century, the gang had expanded beyond Corlear's Hook and changed its criminal focus from petty theft to pimping, using the many disorderly houses, brothels, along Allen Street to amass a small fortune. During this time, the gang became known as the Allen Street Cadets. Cadet being Bowery slang for a pimp, they adopted a flamboyant lifestyle. According to one local charity worker, you never saw an Eastman without a woman. Aside from pimping, they also kept their hand in other crimes, running gambling houses, peddling opium, and hiring themselves out as paid goons. One of the gang's clubhouses during this time was Silver Dollar Smith's Saloon on Essex Street. Monk Eastman worked as a sheriff or bouncer there. He quickly became a favorite mercenary for the many Tammany Hall politicians and Wall Street bigwigs who frequented the place. As Monk's fame grew, his gang came to be known simply as the Monk Eastmans or the Eastman Gang. Like many gangs of the time, the Eastmans dressed as dandies. They were well-groomed men who liked to flaunt their wealth. According to Alfred Henry Lewis's 1912 book, The Apaches of New York, many of the gang members were also bicycle enthusiasts, likely owing to Eastman's own interest in the new riding machines. Lewis claims that Monk rented bicycles out of his Broome Street bird shop, and that an associate opened a club in Monk's honor called the Squab Wheelman, after the boss's twin passions, pigeons and bicycles. Eventually, the gang became involved in rivalries with other local gangs, such as the Yakey Yakes and the 5 Points Gang, warring over both territory and work as political sluggers for Tammany Hall. The Eastmans dominated the gang war in the 20th century during the first year. His gang members rallied in pitched battles in the streets of New York, reminiscent of the gangs of the previous century. Eastman was a charismatic leader who often led his men into battle. He attracted many members of the 5 Pointers to defect to the Eastmans, including Richie Fitzpatrick and Max Kid Twist Zwerber. However, as the gang war began to escalate, Tammany politicians forced the leaders to agree to a truce before losing control of the situation. After Monk Eastman was arrested in 1904 for a street mugging, the gang threatened to disintegrate among warring factions, each trying to assert control. By the end of the year, the gang was split between former Eastman lieutenants Max Zwerbach and Richie Fitzpatrick. Threatened by civil war during their war with the 5 Pointers, Zwerbach and Fitzpatrick agreed to meet for a truce in late 1904. However, possibly while attending a peace conference, Fitzpatrick was found shot to death at a local neighborhood saloon near Sheriff Christie Street on November 1, 1904. With the elimination of the remaining members of the Fitzpatrick faction by Zwerbach Lieutenant Vache, Cyclone Louis Lewis several weeks later, Kid Twist Zwerbach took leadership of the Eastmans. He continued his war against the 5 Points Gang on and off during his 4-year reign. Paul Kelly arranged the murders of Zwerbach and Lewis, using an altercation with underling Louis the Lump Pioggi to set them up for an ambush on May 14, 1908. Edward "Monk" Eastman was an American gangster who founded and led the Eastman Gang in the late 19th and early 20th century. It became one of the most powerful street gangs in the city. His aliases included Joseph Joe Morris, Joe Marvin, William Bill Delaney, and Edward Eddie Delaney. Eastman is considered to be one of the last of the 19th century New York City gangsters who preceded the rise of Arnold Rothstein and the Jewish mob. Later, more sophisticated, organized criminal enterprises also included the Italian-American Cosa Nostra. Monk was born Edward Eastman in 1875 in the Corlears Hook section of the Lower East Side of Manhattan of New York City, New York, to Samuel Eastman, a Civil War veteran and wallpaper hanger, and his wife Mary Parks Eastman. They were most likely descended from English ancestors of the colonial period. By the time Monk was 5, his father had abandoned the family. Mary moved with her children to her father George Parks' home on the Upper East Side. Monk was born Edward Eastman in 1875 in the Corlears Hook section of the Lower East Side of Manhattan of New York City, New York, to Samuel Eastman, a Civil War veteran and wallpaper hanger, and his wife Mary Parks Eastman. They were most likely descended from English ancestors of the colonial period. By the time Monk was 5, his father had abandoned the family. Mary moved with her children to her father George Parks' home on the Upper East Side. According to the 1880 United States Census, 5-year-old Edward Eastman lived with his mother and other family on East 75th Street in Manhattan. The household was headed by his maternal grandfather, George Parks, age 68, who worked in a dry goods store. Parks was born in New York, as were both his parents. In the 1870 U.S. Census, Mary Eastman had been living on Cannon Street in the Lower East Side of Manhattan with her husband Samuel Eastman, age 40, born in New York and working as a paper hanger. Living with them were their children Lizzie and Willie, age 3, born in New York. Willie likely died young, as he was not listed with the family in 1880. In the 1860 census, Samuel Eastman was living as a single man in Manhattan in the household of Thomas McSpedden from a prominent old NYC family. His mentor's firm, McSpedden and Baker, on Pine Street in New York, was the official printer for the city government. In addition to running his business, McSpedden served as an elected alderman in NYC and as appointed city fire marshal during the mid-19th century. Eastman worked as a paper hanger. By the 1900 census, Mary Eastman lived in Queens on Curtis Avenue with her daughters Elizabeth and Francine and their families. Edward Eastman is listed in the same census as a bird salesman, residing on East First Street in Lower Manhattan, living with and married since 1896 to Margaret Eastman. Going by the nickname Monk, Eastman was not recorded as having been arrested until after his grandfather died. At some point, Parks helped his grandson set up a pet shop on Broome Street. For years after being widely known as a gangster, Eastman listed bird seller as his occupation on government forms. At some point, he returned to live on the Lower East Side and became involved with the neighborhood gangs made up of poor young men, often children of immigrants. Operations included a bike rental racket, In the 1870 U.S. Census, Mary Eastman had been living on Cannon Street in the Lower East Side of Manhattan with her husband Samuel Eastman, age 40, born in New York and working as a paper hanger. Living with them were their children, Lizzie and Willie, age 3, born in New York. Willie likely died young, as he was not listed with the family in 1880. In the 1860 census, Samuel Eastman was living as a single man in Manhattan in the household of Thomas McSpadden from a prominent old NYC family. His mentor's firm, McSpadden and Baker on Pine Street in New York, was the official printer for the city government. In addition to running his business, McSpadden served as an elected alderman in NYC and as appointed city fire marshal during the mid-19th century. By the 1900 census, Mary Eastman lived in Queens on Curtis Avenue with her daughters Elizabeth and Francine and their families. Edward Eastman is listed in the same census as a bird salesman, residing on East 1st Street in Lower Manhattan, living with and married since 1896 to Margaret Eastman. Going by the nickname Monk, Eastman was not recorded as having been arrested until after his grandfather died. At some point, Parks helped his grandson set up a pet shop on Broome Street. For years after being widely known as a gangster, Eastman listed bird seller as his occupation on government forms. At some point, he returned to live on the Lower East Side and became involved with the neighborhood gangs made up of poor young men, often children of immigrants. Operations included a bike rental racket. In 1898, Monk Eastman was arrested and convicted of larceny under the alias William Murray, one of the many Irish aliases which he used. He was jailed for 3 months on Blackwell's Island. During this time, he belonged to a gang of pimps and thieves known as the Allen Street Cadets. The writer Herbert Asbury described Eastman as having a messy head of wild hair, wearing a derby hat 2 sizes too small for his head, sporting numerous gold-capped teeth, and often parading around shirtless or in tatters, always accompanied by his cherished pigeons. He had a broad 5'6" frame. In time, Monk's reputation as a tough guy earned him the job of sheriff or bouncer at the New Irving Hall, a celebrated club on Broome Street, not far from his pet shop. At the New Irving Hall and Silver Dollar Smith's Saloon, Eastman became acquainted with Tammany Hall politicians, who were powerful in New York and deeply involved with the ethnic immigrant communities. They eventually put him and his cohort to work as repeat voters in elections and strong-arm men to intimidate the opposition. Eastman's greatest rival was Paul Kelly, born Paolo Antonio Vaccarelli, an immigrant leader of the majority Italian Five Points gang. In 1900, at the turn of the 20th century, Eastman lived at 221 East 5th Street, about 2 blocks from Kelly's New Brighton Social Club at 57 Great Jones Street. The warfare between these 2 gangs reached a fever pitch on September 17, 1903, with a protracted gun battle on Rivington Street among dozens of gangsters. 1 gang member was killed and a second reported fatally wounded by a policeman. Numerous innocent civilians were injured. Some 18 members of the Eastman gang were reported as arrested. Tammany Hall worked closely with both Kelly and Eastman to mobilize their members in elections and patronage schemes. Its officials grew tired of the feuding and the bad press generated when civilians were killed or injured in the gang's crossfire. In 1903, Tammany Hall set up a boxing match between Eastman and Kelly in an old barn in the Bronx to settle the feuding. The fight lasted 2 hours, with both men taking hard punishment before it was called a draw. The politicians pressed the leaders to call a truce and end the street violence. On February 3, 1904, Eastman tried to rob a young man on 42nd Street and Broadway in Manhattan. As the man was being followed by two Pinkerton agents, hired by the man's family to keep him out of trouble in the city, the agents intervened. Eastman shot at them while escaping, but was caught by policemen responding to the shooting. Tired of bad publicity from Eastman, Tammany Hall refused to help him. Later that year, Eastman was convicted of attempted assault and sentenced to 10 years in prison at Sing Sing Penitentiary. In 1909, Eastman was released after serving 5 years in prison. During his absence, the Eastman gang had split into several factions. One of his top men, Max Zwerbach, was dead. Since none of the surviving gang factions wanted him as their leader, he was effectively out of power. For several years, Eastman reverted to petty thievery. During this period, he became addicted to opium and served several short jail terms. After open street warfare with the Eastman gang in the early 20th century, which also had ties with Tammany Hall, Kelly and Eastman were ordered by the politicians to end their competition with a boxing match. It ended in a draw. Tammany Hall politicians finally withdrew protection for Eastman, who was convicted and imprisoned on larceny charges in 1904. Kelly lost support when politicians wanted to clean up the Bowery. Gradually, he became involved in rackets of the Longshoremen's Union. Known for his high culture and gentle manners, Kelly is considered the first in the United States to organize crime on a business model. He cultivated a distinguished and sophisticated image, in contrast to the brutish attitude of his peers. J. Robert Nash refers to him as the real father of organized crime in America, and the first modern-day underworld boss. Offering his services to Tammany Hall politician Big Tim Sullivan, Kelly was alleged to have used his gang to help elect Tom Foley against Tammany Hall incumbent Paddy Diver. The latter was a local saloon owner campaigning to keep the red light districts out of the 4th Ward during the 1901 2nd Assembly District primary elections. On the day of the primary on September 17th, Kelly's gang of over 1,500 men assaulted Diver supporters, blocked polling booths, and committed numerous acts of voter fraud to win the election for Foley. Some voted several times during the day. One gang member claimed that, "I got in 53 votes." Foley was the challenger, not the incumbent. The 2nd District already had numerous houses of prostitution, as Diver, a judge and longtime Tammany leader, had to know. Diver was reported to have drawn a pistol on a personal enemy. Kelly later gained control of the vice districts of the 4th and 6th wards, including prostitution, and controlled a virtual criminal monopoly in the 5 Points. In 1903, Kelly was arrested for assault and robbery and served 9 months in jail. On release, Kelly formed the Paul Kelly Association, an athletic club which he used to recruit younger men for his criminal organization. The headquarters were located at 24 Stanton Street. He soon opened the New Brighton Athletic Club, a 2-story cafe and dance hall at 57 Great Jones Street, between Lafayette and Bowery. Kelly charmed socialites and other prominent citizens who frequented his club. Always well-dressed, Kelly spoke French, Italian, and Spanish fluently and appreciated fine art and classical music. His educated and sophisticated persona impressed many of New York's elite. During that time, Kelly's organization expanded into other parts of Manhattan and parts of New Jersey. Some of his top gunmen, such as Kid Twist, Max Zwerbach, and Richie Fitzpatrick, became alienated, defecting to the Eastman gang, where they struggled for power after Eastman was sent to prison. Others, such as Johnny Spanish, went out on their own. Kelly's main rival was Monk Eastman, whose gang of more than 2,000 controlled New York's Lower East Side. Eastman, an old-fashioned thug of the 19th century, was the opposite of the cultured Kelly. While both gangs were under the control of Tammany Hall, the gangs frequently had armed conflict among their members for control of the neutral territory along the Bowery. During a brawl between members of the two factions, Kelly punched Jack Shimsky in the nose. Shimsky, one of Eastman's best subordinates, sought revenge by challenging Kelly to a boxing match. Despite his short stature, 5'2", and slender build, Kelly won the fight. He knocked out Shimsky, a 6', 230-pound man, in the third round. An unconscious Shimsky was carried out of the ring by his seconds. Kelly's 5 Points gang controlled the area to the west of the Bowery, and Eastman's, everything to the east. Tammany Hall wanted a neutral area between them to be off-limits. When the gangs fought openly over the territory, attracting police attention and civic outrage when civilians were wounded, Tammany Hall called Kelly and Eastman to a sit-down meeting. Officials ordered them to have a boxing match to settle the issue. The winner would take control of the prized neutral territory, and the war would end. Both parties agreed, and Kelly and Eastman duked it out, but the fight ended in a draw. The gangs resumed warfare. Eastman was arrested for robbing a man on the west side who was being tailed by Pinkerton detectives hired by his family to protect him. Eastman was convicted of robbery, and Tammany Hall, eager to end the warfare between the gangs, declined to provide protection. Eastman was sentenced to 10 years in Sing Sing prison. With Eastman's arrest, Kelly completely controlled New York. He had internal competition, and in November 1905, Kelly's former lieutenants, Pat Razor Riley and James T. Biff Ellison, now members of the Gopher Gang, tried to kill him at his New Brighton headquarters. Kelly, drinking with bodyguards Bill Harrington and Roughhouse Hogan, returned their fire. Harrington died protecting Kelly. Riley and Ellison escaped, and a wounded Kelly was taken to a private hospital before he could be arrested. Kelly turned himself in a month later, but charges were dropped due to his political connections. Ellison was arrested in 1911, convicted, and sent to prison. He became mentally ill and was placed in an asylum where he died. Riley was found by police, dead from pneumonia, in his basement hideout in Chinatown. The negative publicity from the attempted assassination resulted in the New York Police Commissioner, William McAdoo, closing the New Brighton for the protection of its socialite regulars. This marked the decline of Kelly's dominance in the New York underworld. Tammany Hall also put pressure on Kelly to lower his profile as it sought to clean up the Bowery. After Kelly closed the New Brighton, he moved operations to the Italian immigrant communities in Harlem and Brooklyn. But he also retained ties to his old neighborhood, becoming a vice president of the International Longshoremen's Association, ILA, under his Americanized birth name of Paul Vaccarelli. He was based in the Chelsea area. Kelly and Paul Vaccarelli was expelled from the ILA in 1919, but returned to it later that year. He took leadership of a spontaneous port-wide strike begun in protest against a wage increase of only 5 cents an hour, which management had agreed to. With the support of Mayor John F. Hylan, Kelly was appointed to a commission to resolve the strike. He ended it, but did not achieve any concessions for the strikers.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.